Hello, I'm Desai. Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube. On this episode, I'm joined by our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who's in Tehran for us. Lise, let's begin with recent events. What have you made of everything that's unfolded, especially from your viewpoint there in Tehran?
What seems to be clear, insofar as anything is clear, is that first round of high-level, face-to-face, and it has to be said, historic talks in Islamabad did make what both sides are describing as significant progress. But from there, the account is dramatically different between the two sides. President Trump continues to give these upbeat assessments that they're on the brink of a deal, that there are only insignificant differences remaining. In his words, we can straighten them out. But for Iran, those insignificant differences are actually major concessions. And while we're not exactly clear all of the details of the discussion, what we do know from the last round of very protracted negotiations, which did reach a nuclear deal in 2015, is that these files are highly technical. We're talking about nuclear power after all. They're deeply sensitive because they are asking Iran to make significant concessions, but so too the United States has to. That is in the nature of negotiations, a give and take, so that both sides can say, well, we didn't get everything, but it is still a win-win. And Iran has said there's many gaps to close and some fundamental points. So this is not a deal that can be done in a day. It could not be expected that 47 years of enmity between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America could be removed in so short a time. But what we do here is that they are working on something far less than a grand bargain, but what would still be a significant step, and that is some kind of a framework, is the word being used by some of the Iranians that we've heard from, a memorandum of understanding about some broad points. And then the two sides would agree to embark on a more intensive, more detailed discussions, perhaps over a period of 60 days. Even 60 days may not be enough to close the gaps, but it may be enough to keep a fragile ceasefire in force. So what you have here is two very different political systems, two very different political ideologies, two very different negotiating styles, and to try to mesh them in such a short time would really be considered almost miraculous.
I find it fascinating, the strategies that are being used on both sides. You've mentioned this yourself. You've got Iran on one side who are taking a longer view when it comes to their strategy. Then you've got Donald Trump on the other side in Washington who want immediacy, who want the big deal, and they want it down now. They want it done quickly and they want it done fast.
Yes, and if you wanted to do a quick deal, you'd also have to have a lot of trust between the two sides. You'd also have to have a lot of understanding. You would have also had to have what was achieved, what was a process stretching over 18 months of breakdowns and breakthroughs, with when the last nuclear negotiations, which involved not just the United States and Iran, but other world powers, the permanent members of the UN Security Council and a strong EU delegation, that by the end of it, not only did they have a deal, but they had a better sense of each other. They had earned each other's political respect. Yes, they had stormed out of meetings, they had argued over each other, but they understand each other's sides, and they both ended up making compromises to do the deal. They are just beginning this on this new round of high stakes, high-level negotiations. But on the positive side, a taboo has been broken, that Iranian officials have now agreed to meet face-to-face at this high level with the United States. And that helps them in this decision-making process, that more senior officials can make quicker decisions on the spot. Although it was said that during those talks in Islamabad, that JD Vance and his team had been on the phone half a dozen, maybe a dozen times to President Trump. The Iranians, of course, because of security concerns, and of course this is a big question, how do they reach the Supreme Leader Moshtaba Khamenei? Is he in touch? How seriously injured he is? But they didn't want to. They had to wait till they came back to Tehran. So there's lots of factors in the mix. But let's take them at their word. Both sides want to do a deal, and both sides say that if they don't do a deal, they're ready to return to war. And that's where the situation is now hanging in the balance.
And when it comes to a breakthrough, what could that look like? Because it seems very complicated in terms of how you've outlined it there. We've talked about the enrichment of uranium. We've talked about the importance of the Strait of Hormuz as well and the control of that in particular. So a breakthrough is very difficult to picture at the moment. What could it look like, though, if they are able to somehow meet in the middle and create something which they both agree on?
The last nuclear negotiations, and indeed the last rounds of talks before this war between the United States and Iran, only focused on the narrow nuclear deal. They didn't talk about ballistic missiles. They didn't talk about Iran's proxies and partners in the region. And they didn't have to deal with this new challenge, which has been a gift to Iran in this war. And that is what Iran insists now is its control of that strategic strait, the Strait of Hormuz. So when you're looking at the wide range of issues that have to be resolved, it is going to take a long time. But let's look at it by one of the issues. For example, what President Trump says is the core issue, Iran's nuclear program. He's repeatedly said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And not just that, it cannot have the means to acquire a nuclear weapon. So Iran, before this war, the concession it had made to the American negotiators was, we are willing to put a moratorium on nuclear enrichment for 5 years. Now, bear in mind that Iran is not enriching uranium now, as far as we can see, because of the damage to its nuclear sites in the June war last year, when the United States struck 3 main nuclear centers of Iran's program. What we understand what the Americans are demanding is a 20-year moratorium. Well, it's in the nature of negotiations that would they settle around 10 years? Would that be enough for the Americans? Would President Trump accept that? Would the Iranians, given they have political pressures within their ranks as well, the hardliners who aren't happy about this deal making, could they do that? But that's in the nature of these negotiations, both sides trying to narrow the gap. And to the issue of the stockpile of highly enriched uranium, 440 kilograms enriched to 60%. That's dangerously close to weapons grade. President Trump, in the manner he likes to do deals, is demanding hand over what he calls that nuclear dust. I was speaking with an official this morning. They said, we're not going to hand over this nuclear stockpile. They had offered, again before the war, to dilute it down to 20%. That's not enough to do a deal. So those little details give you a sense of how a deal, what are the elements, what is the nature of the negotiations that you can inch toward a deal. And in that time, you're going to have people walking away from the table, one side or another saying that's not acceptable, one side or another saying I have to go back to the Capitol to discuss. And that is why, again, I keep referring back because they give us a lesson. The last round of negotiations in Vienna in 2015, the Iranian negotiators here had told me some time ago, they went to Vienna for what they thought was 6 days. They stayed for 22 days. I remember the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, clearing his diary for 3 weeks. I thought, wow, can he really do that? And he did. On top of it, he fell off his bicycle when he was cycling through the streets of so he couldn't go anywhere. And other foreign ministers did the same. If you really want to do a deal, you have to get down into the nitty-gritty of the deal, and they're not there yet. And the question is whether President Trump's team, having hollowed out the State Department, are dealing diplomacy really without diplomats. And President Trump says, I know how to do a deal. A deal will be done with my envoys. Let's see. But that's what you need. Those are the ingredients, if you like, if you want to bake a cake of a deal.
Just a word on the Iranian regime. Do you feel as though maybe the United States are fundamentally not really looked at how Iran is run? Have they misread how Iran works? It seems as though Iran are willing to wait this out as long as it takes because they have a strategy and they have a very long-term view of this.
We don't really know what position papers have been given to President Trump, how he's been briefed on the nature of decision-making, the structure of power in this theocracy in the Islamic Republic of Iran. If we go by his statements, and of course we know sometimes his statements are made for one reason or another, to influence the markets, to give a positive impression. But what he keeps saying is that, well, we've achieved regime change in Iran because we've changed the individuals. That is patently incorrect. The regime, they wouldn't call it regime here, they've see it as an opposition statement, but the Islamic order is still in place. Yes, the top echelons of the political and the security establishment have been killed in those assassinations through Israeli airstrikes, but the Iranian system is not dependent on one individual, one decision making. It is a multi-layered security, religious and political system which has been honed and hardened over 47 years since the Islamic Revolution, and it is built for survival. It's built to survive these kinds of shocks. And the way that President Trump seems to be seeing this, because he uses the words, is that he talks about Venezuela as being the perfect scenario. In other words, you took out Nicolas Maduro, not a single life was lost among the American forces, and then you work with Delcy Rodriguez, who moves up from being vice president to president, and basically they find a way to work together largely at the behest of President Donald Trump. That's not going to be the situation here. The system now is much more militarized. It is increasingly dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Even before all of this happened, last year's war, this year's war, the assassinations, the assessment of Iran had been that once the supreme leader, in that case the discussion was passed away, not assassinated, that it would be the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They would be the ones who would have a dividing say. There would be even discussions that the order would become less clerical and much more of commanders literally calling the shots. So this gives you some indication of decision making here. And yes, it takes a long time. It takes a long time to negotiate here. It takes a long time to decide how far they're able and willing to go. And they have their red lines. And some of the red lines they're not going to cross. And some of them, the lines can become pink, or they can move the red lines. But right now, they're only at the start of what, by any realistic assessment, is going to still be a distance to travel.
Lise, as always, thank you so much for your time. At least you said there, our chief international correspondent reporting from Tehran. All of Lisa's material that's being used, it's being used on the condition that none of it is being broadcast on the BBC's Persian service. That restriction also applies to all international media organisations reporting from Iran. As always, thank you so much for your company. Do give us a like and subscribe below, and we'll see you on the next one.